Most people have heard about Yuri Gagarin. Even Sputnik is still popular over 60 years later. But if Gagarin rings a bell as the first man in space, how many people remember the name of Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space? And how many assume that Sally Ride was the first woman in space, when in fact she was only the first American woman in space? When it comes to space records, it's difficult to sort them by some kind of importance. Certainly Gagarin and Sputnik would lead the list, but everything after that is ordered subjectively. Some firsts, however, mean more than others. Allow me to pick a few. My name is Alex Deva, and you're listening to the Soviet Space Saga. In the previous episode, I've talked about the Soyuz 18A disaster when 3 cosmonauts asphyxiated in space. That had been the backup crew of the mission. The primary crew included cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, who, in 1965, had been the first human being to walk in space. That mission was Voskhod 2, and it launched in March of that year. The spacecraft carried Leonov together with Pavel Belyaev. Belyaev, together with the regretted Vladimir Komarov, had been the only 2 cosmonaut candidates who had been trained in the Air Force Academy. For this mission, he was the commander. Alexei Leonov was a different kind of cosmonaut. Most cosmonauts, or astronauts for that matter, are more or less obsessed with flying a spaceship. If you don't believe me, read astronaut Mike Mullane's autobiography. At one point he writes, and I quote, "I would have sold my wife and my children into slavery for a ride to space." End quote. If you think he was joking, go read the rest of his book. But Leonov wasn't like that. What he wanted to be was a painter. The Soviet leadership had long complained about the fact that cosmonauts had, let us say, some difficulty in describing what they were seeing up there. Gagarin, despite doing his utter best, merely managed to repeat the word beautiful a lot. With Leonov it was hoped for more, and he did in fact come back with a number of famous paintings from space. But he also had a stronger side. In the early 60s, a taxi that he was riding together with his wife skidded and fell through the ice in a freezing pond. Leonov rescued both his wife and the taxi driver. Later, in an aeroplane accident, he had to eject and his parachute got tangled in a metallic part of his seat. While falling through the air, he bent the metal with his bare hands and released the parachute. When Korolev designated him to be the first man to walk in space, he took it seriously. In the months leading up to the flight, he cycled 1,000 kilometers, ran 500, and skied 300. When the time came to fly the mission, he was fit as a fiddle. The spacecraft that Leonov and Belyaev were flying in was based on the Vostok model, with the addition of an inflatable airlock. An airlock is a tube that can be closed from both ends. You cannot just open the door of a pressurized spacecraft because all the air would leave. What you do instead is you mount an airlock tube, close it on the spacecraft and open the other one and get out. This is exactly what Alexei Leonov did after donning a special spacesuit. In view of a live television camera on March the 18th, 1965, he emerged from the airlock and became the first human being to walk in space. He didn't do much there. He looked down at Africa, waved for the camera, took some photographs and tried to enjoy the moment. This particular moment lasted for 12 minutes. At the end of the 12 minutes, it was time to re-enter the spacecraft. This proved to be more difficult than expected, since Leonov's spacesuit had become rock stiff because of the air pressure inside it. Working the problem, Leonov did the only thing he could think of. He opened a release valve and let out some air from his suit. This was a breathing hazard, but being stranded outside the spacecraft was the bigger danger. Eventually, he had to bleed off so much air that it became really dangerous. And finally, he was able to force his way back inside. But the troubles didn't end there. The automatic braking system failed, and Belyaev had to fire the retro-rockets manually 1 orbit later. That meant that they didn't land where they'd planned, instead ending up high in the mountains. Their antennas burned off on re-entry, so they were also left without communication. They were written off as dead, and mortuary music was played on the radio and TV in anticipation of their demise. As it happened, their capsule landed in a forest, and the door got stuck against a birch tree. It took a lot of strength to get out, and when they finally did, they found themselves waist deep in snow, with only a small pistol to defend against bears and wolves. They lit up a fire and spent 2 nights alone in the wilderness. After waiting for rescuers, they decided to take their own chances on skis. Leonov and Belyaev were, let us say, a special kind of people. In fact, Leonov had been slated to be the first Soviet man on the moon before the project got cancelled. Instead, he got to fly in the Soyuz Apollo joint missions with the Americans, and much later became vice president of a bank from Moscow. He invented a special gun for cosmonauts that was also a machete. He wrote a biography with introductions by both Neil Armstrong and Tom Hanks. He died in 2019. On the subject of spacewalks, there was, of course, a first woman to walk in space, and she was, as you might guess, a Soviet woman. In fact, she was mentioned in the episode about Tereshkova. She was Svetlana Savitskaya, who had been Tereshkova's backup. In 1982, she became the second woman in space, and then in 1984, she became the first woman to fly to space twice, and the first woman to walk in space. The special brand of Soviet sexism that I've often mentioned was felt by Savitskaya too. In an interview for an American magazine a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union, she recalled that when she entered the space station Salyut for the first time in 1982, cosmonaut Valentin Lebedev presented her with a kitchen apron. If you think this is funny, consider that the gesture must have been planned long in advance for the apron to have been on the space station in time. I leave it to you to decide if this makes the story more funny or less funny. On the subject of sex and race discrimination, when it comes to the first non-white person in space, most people assume it had to have been a NASA astronaut. In fact, NASA did send the first African-American to space in 1983 on the space shuttle. His name is Guyan Stewart Bluford Jr. But actually, the first person of African heritage to go to space was sent there by the Soviets. In 1980, cosmonaut Arnaldo Tamayo Mendez of Cuba flew aboard the Soyuz 38 mission. On that occasion, he also became the first Cuban, or indeed the first Latin American, to travel to Earth orbit. On his return, he became the first ever recipient of the Hero of the Republic of Cuba medal. Mendez's flight was part of the Soviet Interkosmos program, which sought to send cosmonauts from the Soviet Union's allies on space missions. In addition to countries like Cuba, Romania or Vietnam, there were other participants and even capitalist states such as France, the UK or Austria. The stories behind the Soviet firsts in space are amazing and deserving of a lot more time to tell them than I can devote. I'm not going to talk about each and every one, but there's a page on Wikipedia that lists them, and I think it's worth for me to go through the list if only to give you an idea of some of these great accomplishments. Here they are in chronological order. In 1957, the first intercontinental ballistic missile, also capable of orbital launches, the R-7 rocket. The first man-made object in orbit, Sputnik 1. The first animal in orbit, Laika. In 1959, the first rocket ignition in orbit and the first man-made object to leave the gravity of Earth, Luna 1. This became also the first man-made object to pass near the Moon and the first man-made object in an orbit around the Sun. Later, Luna 2 became the first man-made object to impact the Moon, and then Luna 3 sent the first images from the far side of the Moon. In 1960, the first animals to be safely returned from orbit, the dogs Belka and Strelka. In 1961, the first probe launched to Venus. The first human being in space and in Earth orbit, Yuri Gagarin. The first person to spend more than 24 hours in space, German Titov. He was also the first human to sleep in space. In 1962, the first dual flight with crews and the first probe launched to Mars. In 1963, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. In 1964, the first time 3 people went to space together. In 1965, the first spacewalk by Alexei Leonov. Also the first radio telescope in space and the first probe to hit another planet, Venus. In 1966, the first soft landing and radio transmission from the surface of the Moon. Also, the first probe in orbit around the Moon, and the first image of the whole Earth disk. In 1967, the first uncrewed rendezvous and docking in space. 1968, the first living beings to reach the Moon, but not land on it, and then return to Earth. In 1969, the first docking between 2 spacecraft in orbit, with an exchange of crews. In 1970, the first soil samples automatically extracted and returned to Earth from another celestial body, in this case the Moon. Also, the first robotic space rover, again on the Moon. The first interplanetary travel ending with a soft landing and radio transmission from Venus. In 1971, the first space station, Salyut 1. The first probe to impact Mars. The first probe to soft land on Mars. And, back around Earth, the first armed space station. In 1975, the first probe to orbit planet Venus, to make a soft landing on Venus and send the first photos from the surface of Venus. In 1980, the first Hispanic and black person in space, Arnaldo Tamayo Mendes. In 1984, the first woman to walk in space, Svetlana Savitskaya. In 1986, the first crew to visit 2 separate space stations, Mir and Salyut 7. In the same year, the first probes to deploy robotic balloons into the atmosphere of Venus and to return pictures of a comet during a close flyby. Then, the first permanently crewed space station, Mir, which was manned continuously for 10 years between 1989 and 1999. In 1987, the first crew to spend over 1 year in space. And finally, in 1988, the first fully automated flight of a spaceplane, a copy of the American space shuttle, but without the need of a pilot. Depending on astronauts had always been the biggest problem of the NASA shuttle program, and probably led to its cancellation. The Soviets also cancelled a lot of space programs. The spaceplane was only one of them. They had begun working on return mission to Mars, for example. Some of these initiatives vanished together with the Soviet Union dissolution. Others were abandoned for lack of proper leadership and resources. But I think it's fair to say that, by then, the Soviets had gathered an amazing track record with an impressive number of historical firsts, each one a fantastic story in itself. Together, these stories make a long and extraordinary saga, the Soviet space saga. This has been an episode of The Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.